extremists attempt to integrate their views into the center of society. It somehow seems that extremist and terrorist actors are very competent to use this volatility to their advantage. So we could also call them early adopters of all new kinds of online technology.
Hi and welcome to the first episode of the Tech Terror Takedown podcast, where we delve into the most pressing issues at the intersection of technology, safety, terrorism and extremism. I'm your host, Sophia, Rothut researcher at LMU Munich, and today we have a very special guest with us, Professor Diana Rieger. Diana is a communication scientist and media psychologist and holds a professorship at the Department of Media and Communication at LMU Munich. Her research focuses on online radicalisation, hate speech, and the effects of entertaining content. She has also made valuable contributions to the development and evaluation of countermeasures against radicalisation. Diana is also part of the EU project Tech Against Terrorism Europe and is working with us on the pedagogical aspect, specifically on raising awareness and building knowledge about terrorist content online and the European TCO regulation. I'm thrilled to have her on the show to discuss the topic of hashtag and hate, decoding terrorist and extremist online communication and related risks such as online radicalisation. Welcome to the podcast, Diana.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
We all experience it every day. The use of the internet and social media has become a natural component in our daily lives. So it has in the communication of malicious groups like extremist and terrorist ones. Why is online communication that attractive for extremist and terrorist actors?
Yeah, important question. I think there's several points that make the internet now very globally spoken an attractive place for extremist and terrorist actors and their wish to circulate certain messages. One of the points that I would like to mention is that communication online becomes very accessible and reachable. So extremist actors can reach a global audience. They can do so at minimal costs. There's no time or geographical restrictions. And which is also very important is the fact that there's user-generated content. That is, they can self-determine the publication of their content, and this is published without any further gatekeeping practices. And maybe a last point that also relates to the accessibility of the content is that there's many possibilities for network and multiplication effects. For instance, when you create and publish propaganda materials, it can also be shared by others and therefore enhance the reach even further. Maybe a second point that is worth mentioning is that there's room for targeted recruitment. That is that extremist and terrorist actors can tailor their messages to specific audiences and also provide very specific messages that then align with an audience's existing beliefs. So you can personalize the messages and make it very appealing on a personal level for the audience you want to reach online. The next point relates to safety online, and safety in the sense that extremists and terrorists can communicate without having the fear of being detected very quickly. For instance, there's the possibility for encrypted communication in private chats or chat rooms. It's also often referred to as the dark social aspect of the internet. This, for instance, allows to plan activities while at the same time complicating the detection by authorities. And it also ensures some kind of anonymity, for instance, and has technical safety measures, like, for instance, the use of the VPNs or the Tor network, which then is it makes it easy to disseminate and consume radical content without legal consequences and the fear thereof. And the last thing that I would like to mention is that it also has the possibility to serve as a gateway to involvement with the broader public. And this also renders the risk of mainstreaming, for instance. And mainstreaming is maybe an important point to mention here, because it is defined as a strategy that tries to adapt the presentation of extremist narratives in a way that then makes them as inconspicuous as possible. So, The goal of the strategy is then that the broader public that reads messages on the internet slowly and mostly also unknowingly shifts towards the position of the extreme stances. And like this, on the long run, this is, for instance, a fear within society, extremists attempt to integrate their views into the center of society. And yeah, this is maybe very shortly an answer to your question why online communication is so attractive for such actors.
As digital platforms evolve, so do the methods employed by extremist and terrorist groups. How do these actors adapt their online communication to new technologies and new social media trends?
Yeah, it is maybe a characteristic of social media platforms and also of technologies, digital technologies, that they are very volatile and fast moving. So they can change very quickly, and we have to learn each time how to use them. However, it somehow seems that extremist and terrorist actors are very competent to use this volatility to their advantage. So we could also call them early adopters of all new kinds of online technologies. So with the diversification of platforms and content formats, also extremist and terrorist actors adapt to this expanding online landscape. For instance, they use a mix of public and private communication. For public communication, they sometimes use this to be perceived as less extreme, to attract maybe less prepared audiences, and the private communication then is used more for insiders and also has more extreme stances from time to time. They also, as I mentioned before, they are good in the early use of emerging technologies. As two examples, for instance, they use generative AI in the creation of propaganda materials to make them more fast in production, but also more appealing in terms of the visuals. And ISIS, for instance, uses drones to document terrorist attacks and reuse footage for propaganda later on. So they reuse things that they once prepare and then circulate it even further. Also, what we all do on the internet, like interaction and using direct appeals with friends and acquaintances, is also used by extremist actors. For instance, they use the emergence of new technologies for participation, for creating proximity to their followers, and also to create a sense of community. For instance, they create interactive or engaging content like games in which an extremist ideology is also present or exploited. They also use live streaming and documentation in order to encourage direct participation of their viewers, or they even communicate directly with their followers or with interested people through the comment section. And this also might additionally allow to establish a contact or a deeper connection with like-minded internet users. And a further case of live streaming is also that they live stream their terrorist attacks. For instance, Christchurch is one very famous example, which then creates, some kind of a sensation of it is shocking, but at the same time it's also creates a lot of attention, and it further increases the threat of copycat attacks. So in general, I would say that extremist and terrorist actors always give the feeling that they are very quick in adapting new technologies, and we are always a minute behind this fast changing landscape.
Very insightful. Now let's come from their use of digital technologies to the potential consequences. How might harmful content spread by terrorist actors affect society?
Yeah, I think there's also, again, several aspects that can be mentioned here. The utmost fear, I think, why we discuss it here and why it creates a lot of also media attention is that the fear that people, in specific internet users, might feel inspired by extremist or terrorist content and maybe even motivated to join the cause or feel close to the attitudes and the ideology presented there. So the one of the potential aspects for society is the fear or the potential for radicalization and also for consequent recruitment if somebody feels aligned with the attitudes presented in ideological messages he or she might also be easy to be recruited by such terrorist actors. But at the same time, also people who are maybe less inclined to radicalize to extremist content, there's also a consequence for society in the sense that such content can intimidate the public, both on an individual but also on a governmental level, which is also coined as one central aim of terrorism, because it creates a general atmosphere of fear, which is then can have detrimental effects for trust in certain governmental actors, and also fear of losing one's security in one's country, for instance. Another aspect that can be mentioned is the potential risk of polarization. That is, if we see very diverse, very de-lined opinions online, there might be the danger of a deepening of societal cleavages, and extremist actors might be exploiting that by using existing tensions, insecurities of the public, or grievances of society to further deepen this polarization and create two parties that do not want to talk to each other anymore, for instance. Also with especially terrorist content, there might be a legitimization of violence as a means to achieve ideological goals. And this might also lead or increase the risk of co-radicalization, because in most cases when we see one aggressive stance, the other side responds with even more aggression. So one ideological extremist party supporting violence might also lead the other party to become more violent or aggressive. And last, I mentioned this before already, but I want to emphasize it again. It's also a consequence for society that extremist content might be seeding mistrust in institutions. So, for instance, with misinformation, with conspiracy narratives, there's also an increased risk that more and more people have mistrust in elites or in the government, in politics in general, in scientific evidence, and so forth.
Tech platforms can inadvertently become key mediators in these processes. What responsibilities do tech companies have in preventing the spread of terrorist content on their platforms?
Yeah, in general, mostly because of their importance, platforms play a very crucial role in our today's society, not specifically tied to harmful content, but in general, they can serve as mediators that enable the spread and exchange of content online. So from my point of view, it is very important to have them also be aware of their crucial role for society. And because with a lot of messages, information, etc. posted online, the downside is that also harmful content can and of course is spread on the same platforms as, let's say, positive or normal content. So there's some societal responsibility expected for them. For instance, and in my opinion, and some already do, should implement some proactive monitoring of what kind of content is posted online on their platforms, and also have an idea of clear and robust moderation policies, while at the same time, of course, ensuring and respecting human rights of like freedom of expression and also the right to privacy, but to have an idea and a clear policy of what is moderation. How can we implement it on our platform? Also, to what extent is moderation necessary? Also, they could even position themselves and show a clear stance against harmful content, for instance, in their user agreement, or also in their general information of the platform. And ideally, but this is also like mentioned as a very ideal scenario, they could also engage in further user education and public engagement against terrorist content. For instance, they could develop, use, or post counter narratives on their websites, encourage counter speech, and engage in educating their own followers, their own users with regard to responsible handling of terrorist and extremist content. On a more legislative level, they could also collaborate with law enforcement whenever it is necessary. And this goes also hand in hand with the necessary resource allocation with this regard. For instance, increase the staffing for these attempts and for these efforts. Use technology, can also relate to AI, that can identify, manage, and prevent harmful content. And of course, in an ideal world, there would be enough money for that, but I can also see that, of course, this can be difficult for smaller or micro platforms that might not have the financial resources to implement all of the things that I just mentioned. But as a last point, maybe there's also the need for compliance with national and international legal requirements that then apply to the countries that the platforms operate in.
The internet, of course, is not limited by national borders. Which approaches and measures were taken to try to combat the spread of online terrorist content internationally?
As we all know, unfortunately, we have seen several terror attacks in the previous decade, and I will focus on the global or governmental aspects that can be used to combat the spread of terrorist content. But of course, there's also other initiatives like civil society initiatives that focus more on an individual level that I will not go to in this podcast. But I want to mention that there's also a lot of stuff by civil society there. But with regard to maybe the governmental or global level, there's global or international partnerships. One that might be an example is the Christchurch call, which was implemented as a response to the Christchurch terror attack in 2019. And it is an initiative of over 130 governments, online service providers, civil society organizations that all join the force to tackle terrorist and violent extremist content online. As a further response, there's the elaboration and development of industry practices in a very standardized sense. For instance, hash sharing and partnerships that foster the sharing of hashes. There's the idea to use AI and automation as support for content moderation. And there's also, as I mentioned before already, several programs by NGOs, for instance, programs that foster digital literacy and education in the handling of extremist content online. Another response was the enhancement of the collaboration with law enforcement. One initiative or collaboration that I can mention here is Europol's Internet Referral Unit. This is a collaboration with EU member states and tech companies that wants to serve to monitor and refer content that incites or advocates terrorism. A second example would be the national initiatives like UK's CTIRU, that is an abbreviation for Counterterrorism Internet Referral Unit. And last but not least, which also relates to our the Tate project, is EU directives and regulations like the so-called TCO regulation.
You just mentioned the TCO regulation as an approach that is currently in its EU-wide implementation. What is this regulation about?
Yeah, first of all, I mentioned the abbreviation. Only TCO stands for terrorist content online, and the regulation that deals with this terrorist content online is a legislation enacted by the European Union aimed at curbing the spread of terrorist content on the internet, and it was entered into the force on June 7th, 2022. The goal is to give a mandate to hosting service providers to take down terrorist content with 1 hour after they have been called to do so by a competent authority. but it also includes several further requirements for hosting service providers of all sizes, like, for instance, the establishment of a point of contact, or additionally, under certain circumstances, further measures to prevent terrorist content on their platforms, like to proactively detect terrorist content.
Thank you so much, Diana, for sharing your valuable insights. It's been a pleasure to have you with us today. I think it became very clear that the fight against online radicalization and the spread of extremist and terrorist content is complex and requires a multifaceted approach involving tech companies, regulatory bodies, researchers, and the wider community. Dear listeners, many thanks for tuning in. I hope you found this episode as insightful as I did. Make sure to stay tuned for more to come from Diana and her team. We'll be back soon with more discussions on how to tackle harmful content online and conversations about regulatory approaches to it. Until then, stay safe.